Mr. President, today the Senate is taking major steps towards a new, more progressive trade policy that will shut the door on the 1990s North American Free Trade Agreement once and for all. One of the major ways this overall package accomplishes this goal is by kicking in place a tough new regime of enforcing our trade laws. And here I'm talking about our customs package, with the fact that later today the Senate's going to vote to go to conference with the House on strong bipartisan legislation that was passed by the chamber only a few weeks ago by a vote of 78 to 20. And it has long been my view, Mr. President, that vigorous enforcement of our trade laws must be at the forefront of any modern approach to trade at this unique time in history. One of the first questions many citizens ask is, I hear there's talk in Washington, D.C. about passing a new trade law. How about first enforcing the laws that are on the books? And this has been an area that I long have sought to change. And we're beginning to do this with this legislation, and I want to describe it. And for me, Mr. President, this goes back to the days when I chaired the Senate Finance Subcommittee on International Trade and Competitiveness, and we saw such widespread cheating, such widespread flouting of our trade laws. My staff and I set up a sting operation. We set up a sting operation to catch the cheats, in effect almost inviting these people to try to use a website to evade the laws. And they came out of nowhere because they said, hey, cheating has gotten pretty easy. Let's sign up. And we caught a lot of people. So we've said from that point on that we were going to make sure that any new trade legislation took right at the center an approach that would protect hard-working Americans from the misdeeds of trade cheats. And in fact, the core of the bipartisan legislation that heads into conference is a jobs bill that will protect American workers and our exporters from those kind of rip-offs by those who would flout the trade laws. And the fact is, Mr. President, when you finally get tough enforcement of our trade laws, it is a jobs bill. A true jobs bill, because you are doing a better job of enforcing the laws that protect the jobs, the good-paying jobs of American workers. And I guess some people think that you're going to get that tougher enforcement by osmosis. We're going to get it because we're going to pass a law starting today with the conference agreement that's going to have real teeth in it, to enforce our trade laws. Foreign companies and nations employ a whole host of complicated schemes and shadowy tactics to break the trade rules. And they bully American businesses and undercut our workers. So what we said in the Finance Committee on a bipartisan basis, that the name of the game would be to stay out in front of these unfair trade practices that cost our workers good-paying jobs. My colleagues and I believe that the Senate has offered now the right plan to fight back against the trade cheats and protect American jobs and protect our companies from abuse. It really starts with what's called the Enforce Act, which is a proposal I first offered years ago that will give our customs agency more tools to crack down on the cheaters. Then we have a bipartisan, bicameral agreement on the need for an unfair trade alert. That's another major upgrade that responds to what we heard companies and labor folks say again and again, Mr. President. What they would say is the trade enforcement laws get there too late. They get there too late, the plants close, the jobs are gone, the hopes and dreams of working families are shattered. So what we said is we're going to start using some of the data and the information that we have to have a real trade alert so that we can spot what's coming up. Get that information to our communities and our working families and our companies to protect our workers. This unfair trade alert is another major upgrade in how we tackle, Mr. President, enforcing our trade laws. My view is that any bill that comes out of that enforcement conference, the customs conference, needs to reflect important American priorities, and that should certainly include smart protection of our environmental treasures. When our trade agreements establish rules on environmental protection, they've got to be enforced with the same vigor as the rules that knock down barriers for businesses overseas. Our colleague from Colorado, Senator Bennett, offered, in my view, a very constructive proposal that's going to accomplish this important goal. It was overwhelmingly agreed to by the Finance Committee and passed by the Senate. And I'd like to note that much of the good work done by Senator Bennett mirrors what my colleague in the other body, Senator Blumenauer, is doing on this issue as well. It's my view, and that's why it was important to hear from Senator Whitehouse, that climate change is one of the premier challenges of our time. And it's critical to make sure that this enforcement package sends the right message on environmental issues, and whether the issue at hand is climate change, fisheries, or conservation, this package, the package that we're going to be dealing with in the customs conference, strikes the right balance for the environment. Now, I also want to take a moment to build on what I discussed yesterday with respect to the democratic priorities that my colleagues and I are going to fight for in conference. And this stems from an important point that was made by our colleague from North Dakota, Senator Heitkamp, who said that we really need to go in to this customs conference with some markers, some strong markers that lay out a path for some of our priorities with respect to enforcing the customs law. So after the pro-trade Democrats met on Monday night, I talked with Chairman Ryan with respect to these issues, and we intend to champion provisions by Senator Shaheen, which is going to help our small businesses take full advantage of trade. A lot of people say, oh, trade bills are for the big guys. The big guys are the ones who are going to benefit. I've always thought big guys can take care of themselves. They got lots of people to stand up for them. Well, what Senator Shaheen is saying, and it's particularly important in my home state, Mr. President, where we have mostly small businesses, Senator Shaheen is saying that she's going to make sure, as part of the enforcement effort, we beef up the effort to help small businesses, particularly at the state level, not, Mr. President, at the federal level, at the state level, promote these efforts to have more markets for our small businesses in the export field. So in addition to Senator Shaheen's amendment, as far as those markers, those customs markers are concerned, we're also going to make the environmental protection provisions that I just described, authored by Senator Bennett, a priority, and Senator Cantwell's Trade Enforcement Trust Fund. And I'm very hopeful about the Trade Enforcement Trust Fund as well. And suffice it to say, there's interest on both sides of the aisle because there's an awareness that, again, you can have some trade laws. You're going to need some resources in order to make sure they're implemented. So I think that Trade Enforcement Trust Fund is another very important priority, and it is one that the pro-trade Democrats have said would be part of our short list in terms of our customs markers. So as I noted, Mr. President, when I have town meetings at home, had more than 730 of them, going to have more of them this upcoming week, I do find that people say, everybody in Washington talks about new laws, new proposals, trade ideas. Enforce the laws on the books first. And it's been too hard in the past for our businesses, particularly our small businesses, to get the enforcement that matters, the enforcement with teeth, the enforcement that serves as a real deterrent to cheating. So this legislation is our chance to demonstrate that strengthening trade enforcement, the enforcement of the trade laws, will now be an integral part of a new, modern approach to trade, an approach that says we're not part of the 1990s on trade where nobody had websites and iPhones and the like. We've got a modern trade policy with the centerpiece enforcing our trade laws. Our policies are going to give America's trade enforcers the tools they need to fight on behalf of American jobs and American workers and stop the trade cheats who seek to undercut them. I strongly urge my colleagues to vote yes later today on the motion to send the enforcement bill to conference and work on a bipartisan basis, as we did in the Finance Committee, to put strong trade enforcement legislation on the President's desk. Now, Mr. President, I also would like here briefly to make some remarks on the Trade Adjustment Assistance package. As we've said, later today the Senate is going to take a series of votes that again speak to how we kick off a new progressive era in trade policy that closes the books on the trade ideas of the 1990s once and for all. Once again, a key part of that effort is protecting our workers and ensuring that more trade means everybody has an opportunity to get ahead. And that's why the package of legislation under debate expands and extends the support system for America's workers called Trade Adjustment Assistance. Now, this program dates back to the days of President Kennedy. President Kennedy, during his push for the Trade Expansion Act of 1962, called it, and I quote, a program to afford time for American initiative, American adaptability, and American resiliency to assert themselves. Since then, this program has been extended by Republican and Democratic presidents. The program is now a lifeline for more than 100,000 Americans, including 3,000 Oregonians who receive job training and financial support. The heart of it is to provide a springboard to new opportunities, and it guarantees that workers and their families don't get knocked off stride when times are tough. In my view, it is a core element of what I call trade done right. And as I noted yesterday, Mr. President, Tim Nesbitt, the former past president of the Oregon AFL-CIO, essentially said that our legislation was a blueprint for trade done right. Now, for a year and a half, the Trade Adjustment Assistance Program has been running at reduced strength. But that's going to change once this legislation becomes law. The funding for trade adjustment assistance goes back up to a level that will cover everybody who qualifies. Once again, service workers will be eligible for the program because in today's economy, they're facing competition from overseas as well. Trade adjustment assistance would take into account competition from anywhere in the world, not just from our trade agreement partners. There are significant improvements here that I will tell you, Mr. Chairman and colleagues, I fought very, very hard for in what were negotiations that really lasted well over 6 months with Chairman Hatch and Chairman Ryan. I believe these changes are going to make a big difference for workers across our nation who fall on tough times. If China manages to lure a manufacturer away from the United States, for example, now those workers will be covered. They'll have a chance to learn new skills and find a job that pays good wages. And they won't have to worry about whether the bills will get paid or if they're going to have food on their table. Along with trade adjustment assistance, this legislation will reinstate the health coverage tax credit that expired at the end of last year. Now, the majority of workers in this country, tens of millions of middle-class people and their families, get health insurance through their employer. The health coverage tax credit guarantees that workers and families affected by trade are going to still be able to see their doctor. If they get sick or suffer an injury, they aren't going to face colossal medical bills or the threat of bankruptcy. They get protection, and they get it until they're back on their feet. Now, in the process of bringing this legislation together, my friend and colleague on the Finance Committee, Senator Brown, offered a proposal that goes a long way, in my view, to strengthening our enforcement of key trade laws. It's called leveling the playing field. I urge the Senate Majority Leader to include this important legislation in the TAA bill, both because it's a good policy and it's a sign that both parties are working on issues that are logical, bipartisan priorities. Level the playing field, and I can say this, Mr. President, at this point in the debate, if you look at the Senate Finance Committee files, level the playing field was a top priority for those in the unions, the steel unions and others, and it was also a top priority for their companies. And so having this policy in the trade adjustment assistance is exactly the kind of bipartisan work that the American people want done. Business, labor, Democrats, Republicans, a strong record of evidence as to why it's needed. This legislation is going to be the difference between steel workers and paper workers being on the job or being laid off, because it ensures that the remedies of trade law, what's called countervailing duty law and anti-dumping law, is going to be available to workers and their companies earlier and in a more comprehensive way. It's going to protect jobs, and it's a priority of both political parties. I made mention how important this was to me. My first hearing when I became chairman of the Finance Trade Subcommittee was on trade enforcement. So I could have taken a lot of topics. Mr. President, we could have talked about exports, hugely important to my state. We could have talked about the fact that the trade laws haven't kept up with the digital age, hugely important to the state. I said my first hearing was going to be on trade enforcement. And my good friend from the steelworkers, Leo Gerard, together with U.S. Steel Chairman Mario Longhi, spoke at length about how American workers wanted to see the Senate and the Finance Committee stand up for them and finally fix the shortcomings in our trade remedy laws. That's what we have done now, getting behind Sherrod Brown's proposal to strengthen our trade laws, to stop unfair trade, so that foreign companies do not undercut American workers and manufacturers ought to be an American priority, a red, white, and blue priority, a priority for every member of this body. And I'm proud to have worked with Senator Brown on this important issue. I want to thank him for the fact that he has brought this up again and again and again. I said quite some time ago that we weren't going to let this package become law without level the playing field, authored by Senator Brown at the outset, and that is going to be the case, and I thank him for his work. The three programs, the Trade Adjustment Assistance Program, the Health Coverage Tax Credit, Senator Brown's Leveling the Playing Field Act, are now moving through the Senate alongside legislation that creates new economic opportunities for impoverished countries in Africa and other places around the world. This trade package will extend the biggest of these programs, the African Growth and Opportunity Act, what's called AGOA, for 10 years. I am a strong believer in AGOA. It works for our country, it works for Africa, and it builds a stronger economic future for so many around the world. We worked hard, again, on a bipartisan basis in the Finance Committee to find ways to strengthen AGOA. That was the point of our hearing, to find ways to strengthen it, extend it for another decade. And the committee came together on a bipartisan basis to make smart improvements. Once again, Mr. President, you see the value of a progressive trade policy. Two of our very outstanding colleagues, my colleague Senator Coons on this side of the aisle, our friend Senator Isaacson on the other side of the aisle, always working in a bipartisan way, pointing out that this is what our country is all about, and certainly creating opportunities in impoverished parts of the world is a core American priority, hearts and minds around the world, hoping that we'll have this kind of leadership. And I'll just close, Mr. President, and I think this will be my last comment before the vote. It's my view that for all who want to see trade done right, for all who want American workers to thrive in the 21st century, getting behind these key programs is an ideal way to do it. By supporting this legislation, the Congress reaffirms, as President Kennedy really rhapsodized over half a century ago, you get behind these programs, it reaffirms America's commitment to American initiative, to adaptability and resiliency, and I encourage all of my colleagues to vote yes to support these important programs when we vote later today. Mr. President, I yield the floor.